There is a particular kind of darkness that finds a man not all at once, but slowly, the way a Kansas winter moves across open country. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with thunder or ceremony. It simply comes, degrees at a time, until one morning a man wakes up and realizes the warmth he thought he had is gone, and has been gone for a long time, and he was the last one to know it. Ray Colton was 52 years old when he learned this about darkness. He was sleeping in the cab of a 2009 Ford F250 in the parking lot of a Home Depot in Omaha, Nebraska. Not the bed of the truck, the cab. Because a man sleeping in the bed of his own truck, out in the open where anyone walking to their car with a cart full of lumber could see him, still had some pride left. The cab gave him that much. Four walls of rusted steel and cracked vinyl, windows fogged with his own breath, a door that only locked from the inside if you held the handle at just the right angle. He had been sleeping there for 11 days. On the dashboard, held in place by a strip of electrical tape because the little plastic clip had broken years ago, was a photograph of a girl. 16 years old in the picture, though she was the same age now, taken at a school event Ray had actually managed to attend. She was laughing at something outside the frame. Her eyes were her mother's eyes, dark and direct. But the laugh was something else entirely. Something that had come from somewhere between both of them. And it was the most beautiful thing Ray Colton had ever helped make. Her name was Jessie. He looked at that photograph every morning when he woke up and every night before he closed his eyes, and it was the only thing that kept the darkness from becoming something permanent. Outside the truck, Omaha went about its business. Men in clean clothes loaded lumber and drywall and bags of concrete mixed into vehicles they owned. Vehicles parked in driveways of houses with their names on the mortgage. Ray had been one of those men once. For 23 years, he had been one of those men. He had built things with his hands and managed crews and signed contracts and driven home at the end of the day to a house on Cortlandt Avenue with a maple tree in the front yard that he had planted himself the year Jessie was born. That house was gone now. The maple tree was still there. He had driven past it once in the first week after the divorce was finalized, just to see. The new owners had put a tire swing on one of the lower branches. It looked good. It looked like exactly what a maple tree in a front yard should look like. And Ray had sat across the street in his truck for about 4 minutes before he understood that staying any longer would cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. He had driven away and not gone back. The way a good marriage ends is not the way people imagine it. There is no single moment, no dramatic confrontation where everything is said and the truth finally surfaces like something drowned coming back up. A good marriage ends the way a good building deteriorates when no one maintains it. Quietly, in the places no one thinks to look, until the structure that seems solid from the outside has nothing left holding it together. Ray had built things his whole life. He had never learned how to maintain them. Carol Colton was not a villain. This was something Ray had to work very hard to hold on to in those first months, because it would have been easier, far easier, to make her one. She was a woman who had spent 25 years being patient with a man who treated his marriage like a project he would get to when the more urgent projects were finished. She had raised Jessie largely alone while Ray worked 70-hour weeks. She had managed the household, the finances, the social obligations, all the invisible labor that kept a family functioning. And she had done it without complaint for a very long time before the complaints started, and then for some time after the complaints stopped being heard. Ray had not been absent in the way of men who don't care. He had been absent in the way of men who care enormously about the wrong things at the wrong time, who mistake providing for being present, who believe that building something for your family and being there for your family are the same act performed in different rooms. They are not the same act. Carol had tried to tell him this in various ways over many years, and Ray had heard her the way a man hears traffic, as background noise in a life oriented toward other priorities. When Carol finally decided to leave, she left the way she had done everything else in their marriage, thoroughly and without half measures. Her attorney was a woman named Hargrove, sharp and methodical, who had clearly reviewed every document, every account, every asset before the first meeting. Ray's attorney was a tired man named Patterson, who seemed defeated before the proceedings began, and who had told Ray in a quiet voice during a recess that the way Carol had structured their finances over the years, with the house in her name for tax purposes, the business accounts managed under her signature, The joint savings gradually moved to accounts Ray had access to in theory, but had never thought to monitor in practice, meant that what looked like a marriage was, on paper, something else entirely. Ray had trusted her completely. He had handed her the keys to everything and gone back to work, because that was what he knew how to do, and because he had believed, without ever examining the belief, that trust given freely would be honored in kind. He had been wrong about that, not wrong about Carol exactly. She had not set out to strip him bare from the beginning, the way a true schemer would. She had simply, over years of being undervalued and overlooked, made decisions that protected herself, and then more decisions. And then her attorney had taken those decisions and built from them a legal architecture that left Ray with almost nothing. It was not malice at the origin, but the end result of accumulated self-protection deployed by a skilled attorney against a man who hadn't been paying attention looked a great deal like malice from the receiving end. The business collapsed 6 months after the divorce. Without Carol managing the back office, contracts slipped. Invoices went unpaid and then unfiled. Suppliers lost patience. Ray had tried to hold it together the way he held everything together, through sheer physical effort and stubborn will. But you cannot frame a house when you are fielding calls from creditors at 6 in the morning and sleeping in your truck at night and carrying the particular weight of a man who has finally understood that he was the last person in his own life to know what was happening. He sold the equipment to cover the worst of the debts. The crew, men he had worked with for years, some of them for over a decade, found other jobs. There was no dramatic ending. There was just a Tuesday afternoon when Ray sat in an empty lot where his company's trucks used to park and understood that there was nothing left to save. That was 3 months before the Home Depot parking lot. That was 11 months before Kansas. He found the listing at 2 in the morning, the way a drowning man finds something to hold on to, not through searching exactly, but through desperate movement in a dark space. He had been scrolling through his phone because sleep wouldn't come, moving through forums and listings and the digital debris of other people's lives, when he saw it. Someone had posted it on a rural real estate forum with the energy of a person sharing a joke. Historic working ranch, western Kansas. As is, $1 plus assumption of back taxes. Motivated seller, the county. Serious inquiries only. And we do mean serious. The photographs showed devastation. A farmhouse listing to one side like a ship taking on water. A barn with half its roof gone. The remaining structure open to the sky, its wooden ribs exposed and bleached white by decades of sun. A windmill frozen mid-turn, its blades locked in a position that suggested the last wind that moved, it had moved it and then stopped, and the whole world had gone still since then. Fence lines that had stopped being fence lines and become something more like suggestions. Tilted posts connected by rust and memory. Ray looked at those photographs for a long time. Another man would have kept scrolling. Another man would have seen ruins and moved on. But Ray Colton had spent 30 years reading structures, understanding what was surface damage and what was bone-deep failure. And what he saw in those photographs was not a lost cause. He saw foundation stones that were still true. He saw walls that had not shifted from their original lines. He saw a place where someone had built something real, something meant to last, and the decades had been hard on it. But the thing itself, the essential thing, was still there underneath all the decay. He saw a problem that had solutions. He also saw the price. The back taxes totaled $8,200. Ray had $9,000 left in a checking account that was not frozen because Carol's attorney had not thought it worth the effort to touch something so small. $9,000 was everything he had in the world. Taking on the ranch would clean him out completely and leave him with $1, a truck, and a piece of broken-down property in a state he had passed through exactly once in his life. He called the county assessor's office when it opened at 8 the next morning. The woman who answered sounded surprised that anyone was calling about the listing. "I should tell you," she said carefully, "that property is in very rough shape. Been abandoned close to 20 years. No utilities connected. The well situation is uncertain. The house needs significant structural work." "I do structural work," Ray said. A pause on the line. "It's pretty remote. Nearest town is 40 minutes east. Not much out there but wind and open country." "That's all right." Another pause, longer this time, carrying the particular weight of someone deciding how much to say. "The property has a history, Some folks around here have opinions about it. I just want you to have realistic expectations. I appreciate that, Ray said. I'd like to proceed. Telling Jesse was harder than the county assessor's office. They met at a diner on Dodge Street, neutral territory, which was how Carol had insisted things be arranged since the divorce. Ray had arrived early and ordered coffee he didn't drink, and he sat in a corner booth and watched the door and thought about how strange it was to wait for your own daughter like she was someone you needed to make a good impression on. When Jessie walked in, she looked older than 16. Not in the way children look older when they are trying to seem grown, but in the way that children sometimes look when life has handed them weight they didn't ask for, and they have been carrying it long enough that it has changed the way they hold themselves. She was tall, like Carol, and she had raised jaw in Carol's eyes, and she crossed the diner without looking directly at him, which was something she had been doing for about 8 months now. She sat down across from him and looked at the menu, even though they both knew what she would order. I bought a place, Ray said after the waitress had come and gone. Out in Kansas, a ranch. Jessie looked up from the menu. Her expression was not what he had expected. It was not anger, not immediately. It was something more like the careful blankness of someone who has been surprised before and has learned to hold their face still while they assess whether this particular surprise requires energy. You bought a ranch, she said. It needs work, significant work, but the bones are there. Dad, she set the menu down. You're a contractor from Omaha. Was a contractor. Something moved across her face at that. She looked away toward the window, where the Omaha afternoon was proceeding without regard for either of them. I want you to come with me, Ray said. She looked back at him. What? It has space. You'd have your own room. There's a school in the county seat 40 minutes away. It's not Omaha, but it's something. A start. A start. Her voice was quiet and flat, the way a road is flat before it drops. Dad, I have a life here. I have school here. I have friends. You want me to leave all of that to go live in a broken-down ranch in the middle of nowhere with a father who... She stopped herself. With a father who what? She shook her head and looked back out the window. He wanted to tell her that he knew. That he knew he had not been there the way a father should be there. Not just since the divorce, but before it. For years before it, all those evenings he had come home after she was already in bed, all those weekends taken by projects and deadlines, all those times Carol had called and he had said he would be home by 7 and arrived at 9:30 with sawdust in his hair and an apology that had stopped meaning anything long before he stopped offering it. He wanted to tell her that the man who had done all that was not the man sitting across from her now. That loss had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. But he had learned slowly and at great cost that telling a person something is not the same as showing them. And Jesse had heard enough of what he intended to do. What happened next surprised him more than anything in the preceding year. Carol called him that evening and told him, in a voice that was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, that she thought it might be good for Jesse to go. She didn't elaborate beyond that. Ray didn't push. He simply said, thank you in the small, careful voice of a man who has received an unexpected grace and knows better than to question it. He thought about that call for a long time afterward. Carol was not a woman who made decisions carelessly, and this one, releasing her daughter to a man she had spent 2 years in a legal battle against, was not careless. He suspected she had seen something in Jesse over the preceding months that told her their daughter needed something Carol could not provide. Not material comfort, not stability, something harder to name. The particular presence of a parent who was failing and trying in plain sight without pretending otherwise. Maybe Carol had recognized that a father who was broken and honest about it was worth more to a 16-year-old than a father who was successful and absent. Or maybe she was simply exhausted. Ray had learned at considerable personal cost that both things could be true at the same time. Jessie packed 2 suitcases. She did not speak during the packing. She did not speak much during the 6-hour drive west either, responding to Ray's attempts at conversation with the minimum syllables required to technically constitute a response. By the 3rd hour, Ray had let the silence settle between them and simply driven, watching the land flatten and expand around them, watching Omaha's density thin out into towns and then into open country, the sky growing larger as the distance from everything familiar grew. When they pulled up to the ranch in the late afternoon light, Jessie looked at the property for the first time in person and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You've got to be kidding me." "It needs work," Ray said. "It needs a bulldozer." But they got out of the truck because there was nowhere else to go, and because Ray Colton's daughter, whatever else she was feeling, was not the kind of person who stayed in the truck. The first morning was a Thursday. Ray woke before dawn to a silence so complete it felt physical, a pressure against the eardrums where city noise had always been. No traffic, no neighbors, no industrial hum, just wind moving through the broken boards of the barn across the yard, and the settling sounds of a house adjusting to the temperature, and somewhere out beyond the fence line, the high, solitary cry of something wild calling into a darkness too large to answer back. He made coffee on the camp stove he had set up in the kitchen, because the electrical system was one of approximately 40 things that needed attention before the house could be considered functional. He stood at the window with the mug and looked at what he had bought. In the early morning light, stripped of the romantic haze of desperation that had accompanied his first viewing, the place was genuinely daunting. The porch ran the length of the house's front face and had developed a pronounced lean in its left third, where a support post had rotted through at its base and been left unaddressed for what looked like years. The roof over the back addition was missing shingles in a pattern that suggested a single significant weather event rather than gradual deterioration. One bad storm, one winter of ice and wind, and the damage had simply been left there to compound. The barn was worse. What remained of the structure was technically standing, but the standing was provisional, dependent on a combination of residual structural memory and the absence of serious wind. Ray looked at all of this and did what he had always done when confronting a large problem. He broke it into pieces, arranged the pieces in order of urgency, and identified the first thing that needed to happen. The cellar needed to be cleared. He had looked at it briefly the day before, just enough to confirm that it was there and accessible and not immediately dangerous. A root cellar dug into the earth beneath the house, accessed through a wooden trap door in the kitchen floor. The kind of thing farmhouses had before refrigeration made them unnecessary, and that had been used for storage of one kind or another for decades after their original purpose was obsolete. The kind of thing that accumulated history in the way that dark, forgotten spaces do. Not deliberately, not through any act of preservation, but simply because no one had come to disturb it. He was on his third wheelbarrow load of debris when he found the trapdoor within the trapdoor. He almost missed it. He had been working in the back corner of the cellar where the ceiling beams ran low, and his work lamp cast shadows that shifted as he moved. He had pulled up a section of rotted wood from what he had assumed was subfloor, reaching for a piece of debris caught underneath it, when his hand found the edge of something deliberate. A frame, cut with intention. A door within the floor of the cellar, set flush and invisible unless you knew to look, sealed with age and dark and the weight of whatever had been placed above it over the decades. He cleared the remaining debris carefully. Then he found the lock. An iron padlock, rust-claimed at the corners but intact at the shackle, holding the trap door sealed with a determination that said, "Not accidental, not forgotten, hidden." Ray sat back on his heels in the dirt and looked at it for a moment. Then he went upstairs for his bolt cutters. The box was iron, heavy, roughly the size of a shoebox but denser, carrying the weight of a thing made to last rather than to be convenient. He carried it up into the afternoon light, set it on the porch railing where the sun could reach it, and looked at it for a long time before he opened it. The lock yielded to his bolt cutters on the second attempt. The lid, when he lifted it, released a smell that was particular and unmistakable to anyone who had spent time around old things. Paper and dust and something organic underneath. The specific scent of a life sealed away from air and time, and the indifference of the years. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone brittle at the edges, were the pieces of a life. A journal, leather-bound, its cover cracked along the spine. He opened it carefully, handling the pages the way you handle something that might not survive rough treatment. On the first page, in handwriting that was confident and careful, the letters of a man who had learned penmanship before it became optional. Property of Walter H. Briggs, January 1951. Beneath the journal, photographs. Black and white, faded to gray at the edges. A young man in a military uniform, serious-faced, strong-jawed, the bearing of someone who had been somewhere that changed the way he stood. The same man, older, standing with a woman in front of a farmhouse. A farmhouse Ray recognized because he was standing in front of its ruins right now. In the photograph, it had been new. The porch had been straight. The paint had been fresh. The windmill behind it had been turning. Military medals. A bronze star. A purple heart. Their ribbons faded but still holding their color. Orange and blue. The way certain things hold on to what they were long after everything around them has let go. Legal documents. Property records. Partnership agreements. And at the bottom, tated with a length of twine that had dried to the color of old straw, a bundle of letters he did not yet open. Ray picked up the journal and began to read. He read for a long time, standing at first, then sitting on the porch steps, then moving his camp chair out into the fading afternoon light because the porch shadow had crept over him, and he wanted to see the pages clearly. The journal was dated from January of 1951 through October of 1953, with entries that ranged from daily to sporadic, the frequency itself telling a story about the quality of the times recorded. The early entries were the work of an optimistic man. Walter Briggs had come back from the war with a bronze star, a purple heart, and the particular determination of someone who has seen what the world can be at its worst and decided to answer it by building something good. He had found a piece of Kansas land and a partner named Clifton Marsh, and together they had put their names on a 50-50 partnership agreement and started a cattle operation with the energy of men who believed that hard work and honest dealing were sufficient protection against whatever the world might send at them. The handwriting in those early pages was bold, the sentences long, the observations full of a man's pleasure in the specific details of his life. The weight of a new calf at first light, the way the fence line looked after a week of work, the quality of the water from the well in the northeast corner, clear and cold even in August heat. Clifton's idea for expanding the herd in spring, which Walt thought was ambitious but probably right. Then gradually the tone began to change. The change was not dramatic. It was the kind of change that only becomes visible in retrospect, when you are reading the whole journal and can see the arc of it. A note of uncertainty here, a record of a discrepancy there. Walt's handwriting stayed the same, but the sentences grew shorter, the observations less generous. The pleasure in daily life replaced by a watchfulness that had no pleasure in it at all. Counted the herd today. Clifton has the book showing 247 head. I counted 229. Mentioned it to him this evening. He says I miscounted. Maybe I did. Counted again tomorrow and got 231. Something is not right. And later, payment came in from the stockman's sale. Amount doesn't match what I calculated based on the head count and the market price. Clifton says the market was soft and buyers were difficult. Maybe, but the numbers don't add up the way they should. And later still, asked to see the full books today. Clifton got angry, said I was questioning his integrity, said he'd been handling the business side since the beginning and I should focus on the ranch work and trust him. I told him trust needs something to stand on. He didn't like that. Ray read those entries and felt something move in his chest that was not quite pain and not quite recognition, but lived in the territory between them. He had written almost exactly those words in his head, lying awake in the truck cab in the Home Depot parking lot, substituting Carol's name for Clifton's in the slow dismantling of their financial life for the stolen cattle and the false invoices. The specific facts were different. The shape of the betrayal was identical. Two men separated by 70 years who had made the same mistake. They had believed in people who were good at being believed in and had kept believing past the point where the evidence made belief reasonable, because trusting someone is an act of will as much as an act of judgment. And once you have decided to trust a person, unmade that decision feels like a failure of character rather than a correction of error. He was still reading when Jessie came out onto the porch. She had spent the afternoon in the room Ray had cleared for her, which she had accepted without comment, which was the closest thing to gratitude the situation allowed for now. She stood in the doorway with her phone in her hand, and she looked at her father sitting in the camp chair with an old journal open in his lap, and something in his expression made her stop before she said whatever she had come to say. Found something, Ray said without looking up. Jessie leaned against the door frame. She did not come out, but she did not go back in. Guy named Walt Briggs owned this place back in the early 50s, Bought it with a partner, man named Clifton Marsh. They were going to build something together. Split everything 50-50, cattle operation, the land, all of it. Ray turned a page carefully. First couple of years, it sounds good, optimistic. Then things start to go sideways. Cattle counts that don't add up. Money going out that doesn't match what's coming in. Walt starts asking questions, and his partner starts getting angry. Jessie was quiet for a moment. Sounds like someone we know, she said. It was the first real sentence she had directed at him since Omaha. Not a hostile sentence, not a loaded one. Just a sentence that acknowledged something they had in common, which was the experience of watching trust dissolve under the weight of evidence that the trusted person preferred you to ignore. Ray looked up. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking out at the darkening field, the broken windmill turning slowly in the evening wind, making its rusty quarter turn and stopping, quarter turn and stopping, like a clock that had lost confidence in itself. But the words were out there between them now, and they were not cruel words. They were just words, true ones. The journal ends in October of 1953, Ray said, right in the middle of a sentence, like he was interrupted. What happened to him? I don't know yet. Jessie was quiet for another moment. Then she pushed herself off the doorframe and came out onto the porch and sat on the railing with her back to the field. And she held out her hand for the photograph that Ray had set on the rail beside him. He handed it to her. She looked at the man in front of the farmhouse, at the woman beside him, at the straight porch and the fresh paint and the turning windmill. He looks like someone who thought things would work out, she said. He did, Ray said, right up until they didn't. Agnes Holt appeared the following morning. Ray was loading debris into the truck bed when he saw her at the property line. A small woman bent with age, moving with the careful economy of someone whose bones had opinions about the cold. She was 91 years old, though she did not look it in the way some people don't look their age because they have maintained some youthful quality. She looked every one of her years and had simply decided that years were not a reason to stop moving. She stood at the edge of what had once been a proper fence and watched him with eyes that were sharp in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with attention. "You're the fool bought this place," she said when Ray walked over. "Yes, ma'am." "Ray Colton?" He stopped. "That's right. You know my name?" She didn't answer that directly. She looked past him at the house and something moved across her face. Not quite pain and not quite relief, but something that lived in the territory between them, in the space where long-held things finally find a little room. "Used to be something fine," she said. Before what?" She looked at him then, directly and for long enough that he felt assessed in some thorough way he couldn't fully account for. The kind of assessment that takes in not just what a person looks like, but what they are made of and whether it will hold. "Before the wrong man won," she said. She turned to leave, and Ray almost let her go. Then he remembered what he had found the day before, and he said, "I found a lockbox in the cellar. Belonged to a man named Walter Briggs." Agnes stopped walking. She did not turn around immediately. She stood with her back to him for long enough that the wind moved through the grass between them twice, bending the dry stalks east and letting them straighten and bending them again. "Word of advice, Mr. Colton," she said finally, still not turning. "If you start finding things, old things, it might be best to leave them where they are. Some history is better off buried." She walked back toward her property without looking back. Ray stood in the morning light and watched her go, and understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes from watching the way a person moves when they don't know they're being read, that Agnes Holt was not warning him away from history in the abstract. She was warning him away from something specific, something she knew, something that had been waiting a very long time for the wrong person not to find it. That night, Ray found the watch. He was finishing the last corner of the cellar, working by lantern light, on his knees in the dirt, clearing the area near the back wall, when the light caught something between two floorboards. A glint of tarnished metal, barely visible. The kind of thing you see only when the light hits at exactly the right angle, and you happen to be looking at exactly the right moment. He worked it free with a flathead screwdriver, prying up the board edge millimeter by millimeter until the thing beneath came loose and dropped into his palm. A pocket watch, silver, tarnished black in patches, the case worn smooth at the edges in the way of things handled by the same hands for years. He rubbed the face clean with his thumb and saw that the hands had stopped at 3:47. Morning or evening, there was no way to know. The crystal was intact, which seemed remarkable, given everything else. He turned it over. On the back, engraved in careful script that matched the handwriting in the journal, were the words WB to CM, Brothers in Arms, Walter Briggs to Clifton Marsh. Ray sat in the dirt of the cellar with the watch in his palm and felt the weight of it. Not the physical weight, which was small, but the other weight, the weight of a gift given in trust between two men who believed they were building something together. A gift that said, I trust you with the best of what I am. A gift that said, we are the kind of men who stand by each other. A gift that had ended up hidden between the floorboards of a cellar in a house abandoned for 20 years, on a ranch that had passed through hands under circumstances that nobody in this county seemed particularly eager to discuss. He took the watch upstairs and set it on the window ledge beside the photograph of Walter Briggs and the woman standing in front of the house when it was new. Then he picked up the journal and read it through until the light outside had gone completely dark, until he reached the last entry, the one that ended mid-sentence on the 12th of October, 1953, the day before Walt had written that he intended to confront his partner with everything he had found. The pen stroke at the end of the last word trailed off the page, the way a pen trails when a hand is interrupted mid-motion. Not the decisive period of a finished thought, just a line that went nowhere, stopping in the middle of something that was never finished. He read that last entry twice. Then he sat in the quiet of an old house on the Kansas prairie and thought about a man who had gone to sleep on the night of October 12th, 1953, believing that truth was something worth standing up for, even when standing up for it was dangerous. Even when the person you needed to stand up against had power and connections and a long history of the county looking the other way. And he thought about whether that man had been right. Outside, the wind moved through the broken barn like breathing. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called, lonely and unanswered. The watch on the window ledge held its hands at 3:47 and gave nothing away. Ray Colton had come to Kansas for a fresh start. What he had found instead was the beginning of someone else's unfinished story. He did not yet know that the two things were the same. There is a difference between a man who is lost and a man who has chosen a direction. The difference is not always visible from the outside. Both men might look the same clothes, same truck, same weathered face, reading the same flat horizon. But inside something has shifted. Something has found its footing in ground that was previously uncertain. Ray Colton woke on the morning of the 8th day at the ranch and understood, without being able to fully articulate it, that he was no longer the man who had arrived here. He was not yet the man he needed to become. But he was no longer the man sleeping in the Home Depot parking lot, existing in the passive tense, waiting for something outside himself to change. Walt Briggs had done that. A dead man's journal, passed through 70 years of sealed darkness, had reached across time and handed Ray something he hadn't known he needed, a reason to be angry on someone else's behalf. He made coffee in the early light and sat with the journal open on the kitchen table and read the final entries again. He had read them 4 times now. Each time he found something new, not new words, the words were fixed, frozen in October of 1953, but new understanding, the kind that comes when a man reads another man's account of betrayal and recognizes in it the specific shape of his own. Walt had written, 9 days before his final entry, partnership means nothing if only one man honors it. I have done the work. I have kept the books as honestly as I know how. I have given Clifton every chance to explain the discrepancies. He answers with anger, and I am beginning to understand that the anger is not the response of a man wrongly accused. It is the response of a man who has been found out. Ray had put down his coffee cup when he first read that and sat with his hands flat on the table for a long time. Because he had written almost exactly those words himself, in his head, in the long, silent nights of his truck cab, substituting Carol's name for Clifton's, and the slow dismantling of their financial life for the stolen cattle and the false invoices. The specific facts were different. The shape was identical. 2 men, separated by 70 years. One had hidden evidence in an iron box and gone to a meeting he did not return from. The other had sat in a parking lot and stared at a photograph of his daughter and wondered if he still had anything left worth fighting for. Ray picked up the journal, closed it carefully, and placed it back in the iron box. Then he went to find his daughter. Jessie was at the kitchen table with her phone, as she usually was in the mornings, but the phone was face down, which was unusual. She was looking out the window at the broken windmill in the early light, watching it make its slow, uncertain quarter turns in the morning wind. And she did not look up when Ray came in, but she did not perform the specific variety of not looking up that meant she was deliberately ignoring him. This was a distinction Ray had learned to read in the past months. She was thinking, which was different. He poured a second cup of coffee and sat across from her. "I need to go to the county seat today," he said. "Look at some records." "What kind of records?" "Property records, from the 50s. I want to see what actually happened to this ranch after Walt Briggs disappeared." Jessie was quiet for a moment. Outside, the windmill made a slow quarter turn in a gust of wind and stopped again. "You think something happened to him?" "I think something happened to him." She picked up her phone, looked at it, put it back down face first. "I'll come." Ray looked at her. "I have nothing else to do," she said, which was Jessie's way of saying yes without the vulnerability of saying yes. The county seat of Ford County was a town called Dodge City, which Ray had heard of the way everyone had heard of it, the vague familiarity of a name absorbed from westerns and history lessons, and which turned out to be a real place with a real county courthouse and a real records office staffed by a woman in her late 50s named Beverly, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and looked at them the way people in small towns sometimes look at strangers. Not unfriendly exactly, but alert in the way of someone who understands that strangers asking questions have reasons for their questions that may not be entirely comfortable. Ray explained what he was looking for: property records, late 1953 to 1955, for the ranch parcel west of town currently registered in his name. Beverly's fingers moved across her keyboard. She pulled up records, scrolled, printed several pages, handed them to Ray across the counter without much ceremony. Ray read, then he read again. "Property seized for unpaid debts and back taxes, April 1954. Total liabilities, $11,400. Sold at public auction, May 1954. Sale price, $5,500. Purchaser, Clifton Marsh." Ray set the paper down on the counter. "He was the only bidder?" Beverly looked at the screen. "According to the record, yes." "And the mineral rights, the water rights?" More clicking, a longer pause. "Severed from the surface property in June 1954. Registered to Marshland Holdings." She peered at the screen. "Current holder is listed as Garrett Marsh. What's the current assessed value of those rights?" Beverly looked uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who knows the answer and wishes they didn't have to give it. She clicked through several screens. "Estimated value as of last assessment, $640,000. Jessie, standing slightly behind Ray's shoulder, made a small sound that was not quite a word. Ray kept his voice level. "Is there a record of Clifton Marsh's position in county government during that period?" Beverly's discomfort became something more specific. She looked at him over the top of her glasses. "Mr. Colton, I'm just asking what the public record shows." A pause, then as she typed slowly as though hoping the answer would change if she approached it carefully. "Clifton Marsh served on the Ford County Commission from 1952 to 1961. Ray nodded slowly. "So the man who sat on the county commission that would have approved the seizure of his business partner's property was also the man who showed up as the only bidder at the auction and purchased it for less than half the total debt." Beverly said nothing. She looked at her screen with the expression of a woman who has just realized she has been drawn into something larger than a routine records request and cannot now extract herself without the extraction itself becoming part of the record. "Thank you," Ray said. He gathered the printed pages and turned toward the door. "Mr. Colton." Beverly's voice was quiet. He stopped. "The Marsh family has been in this county a long time. Garrett Marsh, Clifton's grandson, he owns the bank here. Sits on the commission, same as his grandfather did. I'm not telling you anything you couldn't find out yourself. I'm just saying." Ray looked at her steadily. "I understand." "I hope you do," she said, and the way she said it made clear that she hoped this with some urgency. They ate lunch in the truck in the courthouse parking lot because neither of them wanted to sit in a diner in a town where the wrong person might overhear something, and Ray did not yet know who the wrong people were, which meant he had to assume they were everywhere. Jesse read through the printed records while Ray drove to the far end of the lot where the shade of an old cottonwood made the cab slightly less brutal. He was on the commission, Jesse said. She said it the way people say things they already suspected but hoped were not true. He approved the seizure of his own partner's property. Looks that way. And the mineral rights. He took those within 2 months of getting the land. Within 2 months of Walt disappearing. She looked up. How much did you say they were worth? 640,000. That's current value. So Walt Briggs was sitting on land worth a fortune, and his partner knew it, and Walt didn't. Or Walt started to figure it out. Ray tapped the journal on the seat between them. He mentions in here that Clifton was having the property surveyed without telling him. He thought it was about the cattle operation. I think it was about what was underground. Jesse was quiet, looking out the windshield at the courthouse, at the Ford County seal above the door, at the world as it presented itself in the ordinary light of a Tuesday afternoon. If someone killed Walt to take this land, she said carefully, and then Clifton's grandson has been collecting money from it for decades. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Yeah, Ray said. They drove home in the particular silence of two people who have just understood that they have walked into something that is larger than it appeared from the outside and shows no sign of getting smaller. He found the metal tube in the barn foundation the next afternoon. He had been working the fence line in the northeast section, the practical work of a man who owned land and needed to make it functional regardless of what historical crimes might be attached to it, when Jessie called from where she had been exploring the collapsed barn perimeter. Dad, here. He found her crouched by the barn's limestone foundation, her fingers tracing the mortar joints between 3 stones that sat slightly recessed from the others. The mortar around them was the wrong color, lighter, less weathered, newer relatively speaking than the original construction. Someone had opened this section of wall and resealed it, and the resealing had been careful but not careful enough to survive a 70-year comparison with the untouched mortar around it. They worked the stones loose together, Ray with his pry bar and Jessie with her hands, both of them moving with the careful urgency of people who know they are close to something important and don't want to damage it before they understand what it is. Behind the stones, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax that had gone yellow and brittle, was a metal tube roughly 18 inches long. Ray opened it at the kitchen table with Jessie beside him. Inside, rolled tight and tied with a piece of string, was a document, a notarized statement, dated October 10, 1953, 2 days before the final journal entry. I, Walter H. Briggs, being of sound mind and full understanding of the risks of making this statement, do hereby record the following as a matter of legal fact. What followed was a detailed accounting, precise, methodical, the work of a man who had grown up learning to keep records and had applied that discipline to documenting his own betrayal. False cattle sales. Walt listed each one, with dates and amounts. Payments diverted from buyers into accounts in Clifton's name only. Invoices for expenses that had never been incurred, submitted against the partnership books to create losses that existed only on paper. The total misappropriated over 18 months, just over $9,000, which in 1953 was enough to buy land, enough to change the entire direction of a life. Each allegation included dates and the names of witnesses who could potentially corroborate. The final paragraph read, "Should my death or disappearance occur following the making of this statement, I request that legal authorities investigate Clifton Marsh thoroughly and without the interference of local political connections. I have hidden copies of financial records and supporting documentation at multiple locations on this property. The truth is here for those who choose to look." Ray read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at Jessie. Her expression had changed from the careful blankness she had deployed since Omaha, that protective neutrality she wore the way soldiers wear armor, not because it is comfortable, but because the alternative is worse, into something more open, more present. He knew he might not make it out of whatever was coming, she said, and he still put it all down in writing. He wanted there to be a record. Even if no one found it for, she gestured at the document, at the date. 70 years. Even then, Jessie looked at the document for a long moment. Why does that feel brave instead of sad? Ray thought about that. Maybe because it means he didn't give up on the idea that it mattered, even at the end, even when he had every reason to. His daughter looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face in a long time. Not in the past year, certainly. Not in the years before that, when he had been a figure who moved through the house at the margins of her day, present in body and absent in the ways that counted. She was looking at him like he was someone worth listening to. He did not push it. He just let it be what it was. Garrett Marsh arrived the following morning. Ray had seen the truck before he heard it. A new Silverado, black, clean in the way of vehicles that are cleaned rather than simply kept out of the rain. It came up the access road at a measured pace and parked behind Ray's truck with the deliberate precision of a man making a point about his right to be wherever he chose to be. Garrett Marsh was 58 years old. He had the tan of a man who spent time outside for reasons of appearance rather than labor, and the posture of a man who had never been made to stand and wait for anything he wanted. He wore jeans and a collared shirt that cost more than Ray's last week of groceries, and he smiled the way powerful men in small places sometimes smile, with warmth on the surface and nothing behind it. The smile of someone who has learned that warmth is a tool rather than a feeling. He extended his hand. "Ray Colton, I'm Garrett Marsh. I own the bank in town." Ray looked at the hand and did not take it. "I know who you are." Something moved behind Garrett's eyes, fast and controlled. The smile stayed where it was, adjusted slightly. "I heard you've been asking questions over at the courthouse about the old property history. I've been getting to know my land." "Of course." Garrett looked past Ray at the house, at the work Ray had done on the porch, at the new boards replacing the rotted ones. "Place is looking better. You've got skills." "What can I do for you, Mr. Marsh?" The smile recalibrated again. "I'll be direct. My grandfather worked this land for years after his partner left. He took on significant debt trying to keep the operation viable. The family has an attachment to the history here. I'd hate to see that history disturbed by misunderstandings." His partner didn't leave, Ray said. A silence. Not a surprise silence. A silence of the kind that follows a statement that has been expected and prepared for. The silence of a man who has rehearsed his response and is now deciding whether to deploy it. "Old stories get complicated over time," Garrett said carefully. "People remember things the way they need to remember them. I'm not working from memory. I'm working from documents." Another silence, slightly different in quality. Garrett Marsh looked at Ray with the eyes of a man running calculations, assessing what was known and what was inferable and what the most efficient response to both might be. "I'd like to make you an offer. $50,000 for the property, as is today. That's significantly more than market value for a parcel in this condition. It would give you a real fresh start." "Not interested." "Mr. Colton, I said no." Garrett held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way men nod when they have received an answer they expected and were hoping against. "I understand." He turned back toward his truck. "I hope you'll reconsider. Life in a rural county can be complicated for someone without deep roots. It helps to have neighbors who are willing to help." He drove away at the same measured pace he had arrived at, the black Silverado leaving a thin line of dust on the access road. Jessie came out of the house where she had been listening from the other side of the screen door. "He's scared," she said. "He's scared," Ray agreed. "What happens next?" "He makes our life difficult and hopes we leave." The next morning, Ray's account at the Dodge City Community Bank was frozen for what the phone representative described as irregular activity requiring review. The hardware store in town declined his order without explanation. The feed and supply store on the county road said they were out of stock on everything Ray needed, which would have been more convincing if the shelves behind the counter had not been visibly abundantly full. "Can he just do that?" Jessie asked that evening. "Just freeze your money?" "He owns the bank. That's not legal." Legal and what actually happens are two different things in a place where one family controls most of the economy. Jessie sat with that for a moment. Then she said quietly and with a heat that Ray had not heard from her before, not anger directed at him, but anger beside him, which was an entirely different thing and felt like the difference between a door slamming in your face and a door opening. "Then we need someone he doesn't control." Dana Reeves had her office above a hardware store in Garden City, 20 minutes further east than Dodge City, which placed it outside the immediate sphere of the Marsh family's local influence. Ray found her through the state bar directory, looking specifically for someone with no visible ties to Ford County. Her nameplate was unassuming, her handshake was direct. She was 44 years old, with the efficient manner of someone who had built her practice on clients who couldn't afford to waste time on pleasantries, and she listened to Ray's account without interrupting, making notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting so small he couldn't read it from across the desk. When he finished, she sat back and looked at the documents he had brought: the notarized statement, the property records, the partnership agreement, for a long time. "If what you're describing is accurate," she said, "and this documentation is authentic, which it appears to be, then the 1954 seizure was fraudulent. A county commissioner voting on the seizure of his business partner's property, then purchasing it at a below-market auction as the only bidder, is textbook self-dealing. It would void the seizure and the mineral rights. If the seizure is void, everything that flowed from it is potentially void, every subsequent transfer." She looked at him over her notepad. "That would include Marshland Holdings' current claim to the mineral and water rights, worth $640,000. Worth $640,000. She set down her pen. "Mr. Colton, I want to be clear with you about what this means. We are talking about dismantling the legal foundation of a family's financial empire. The Marsh family will fight this with everything they have, and they have considerable resources. We would need to build a very strong case before taking any action." "What would a strong case need?" "More than what you have. The financial records Walt Briggs mentions in his statement, if those exist, they would be significant. Any physical evidence connecting Clifton Marsh to Walt Briggs's disappearance." She paused. "A body would help considerably." "Walt mentions a well." Dana looked at him. "In his statement?" "In a letter. There are letters, threats, sent to Walt in the months before he disappeared. The last one mentions a meeting place, the old well, northeast corner of the property." Dana was quiet for a moment. "Have you found that well?" "Not yet." "Find it," she said. The letters were in the root cellar wall. Ray had avoided the back section of the root cellar for practical reasons. The ceiling beams there were lower, and the light from his work lamp cast uncertain shadows. But structural probing with a long screwdriver had confirmed the beams were sound, and he had finally worked his way in with a flashlight and the particular determination of a man who has run out of other places to look and understands that not looking is no longer an option. Behind a loose board in the back wall, wedged into a gap between the foundation stones where it would be invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it, was a bundle wrapped in wax paper. 12 letters, on plain stationery, no return address, no signature. The postmarks were from Dodge City, which told him nothing useful except that they had been sent by someone with access to the local post office, which in 1953 meant approximately everyone. He brought them to the kitchen table and read them in order. June 1953. "You need to stop asking questions. The business is what it is. Take your share and be grateful." July. "Your nosing around is causing problems. Some things are better left alone. Think about what you have to lose." August. "This is your last warning. Drop the accusations or face consequences. You have a woman who cares about you. Think about her." The September letter was explicit in a way that made Ray's jaw tighten. Accidents happen to stubborn men. Fires, falls, disappearances. Nobody would be surprised if a rancher met a bad end out here. The land is unforgiving, and so are some of the people on it. He read them to Jessie that evening. She listened without moving until he finished. "There's one more," he said. He placed the final letter on the table between them. Dated October 11th, 1953, the day before Walt's last journal entry, the entry that ended mid-sentence with a pen stroke that trailed off into nothing. "Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., the old well, northeast corner. Come alone if you want to settle this. Bring your proof if you think it matters. We'll find out what the truth is worth." Jessie read it twice. Then she looked up. "He went. He went. He knew it was a trap, and he went anyway. He thought—" Ray stopped, started again. "He thought that if he went with enough proof, enough documentation, something official, it would matter. That the truth would be enough protection. Was he wrong?" Ray looked at his daughter. "He was wrong about surviving it. I don't know yet if he was wrong about the truth." Jessie was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the long grass in slow waves, visible through the kitchen window. The whole field breathing like a sleeping animal dreaming about something large. She said, without looking at him, You know what's the hardest part of reading all this? What? He sounds exactly like you. The way he writes, the way he thinks. He just kept believing that if he did the right thing would happen. She paused. Mom's lawyer used that against you. The fact that you trusted her, like trusting someone was evidence of stupidity. Maybe it was? No, Sant. Her voice was firm, firmer than he expected. Trusting people isn't stupid. Punishing someone for trusting you is what's wrong. That's what Clifton did to Walt. And that's what... She stopped herself. You can say it, Ray said. She shook her head, not refusing, processing, working through something that required more care than speed. I used to think you were weak, she said finally, carefully, like a person placing weight on ice they are not certain will hold. I thought Mom was strong because she planned everything, and you were weak because you just worked and trusted her and didn't see it coming. But reading Walt, being trusting isn't the same as being weak. It means you believed in something, even if the other person didn't. Ray did not say anything. He understood that some things, said aloud in the presence of a daughter, need to be received in silence to remain intact. After a moment, Jesse picked up the final letter. We need to find that well. The old survey maps were in the county courthouse on the third visit, retrieved by Beverly after a long pause, and with the expression of a woman who had made a private decision she was not entirely certain about. Ray photographed every page. Back at the ranch, he and Jesse spread the historical survey on the kitchen table alongside Walt's hand-drawn property map and aligned them carefully, checking landmark against landmark until the two maps told the same story about the same piece of land. There it was, northeast corner, marked on both maps with the same symbol, a circle with a cross, the universal shorthand for a water source, at coordinates that placed it roughly half a mile from the house, in what was now overgrown pasture that had been reclaiming itself from human use for the better part of 2 decades. They found it on a Thursday afternoon, navigating by GPS, pushing through waist-high grass and brush that grabbed at their boots and jeans as they moved. The ground in the northeast corner was subtly different. A slight depression in the terrain, a bowl-shaped lowering that was only apparent once you were standing in it, the kind of thing that might read as a natural feature to an eye that wasn't specifically looking for something made by human hands. When Ray kicked the grass aside, his boot struck concrete. They cleared the vegetation together, pulling back years of growth from the edges of a concrete cap roughly 6 feet across, weathered and stained and cracked at one edge where freeze and thaw had done their patient work, but intact. Cast into the surface, in letters still legible after 70 years of Kansas weather. Marsh Construction, 1953. Jessie crouched beside it, her hand resting on the letters, tracing them the way you trace something you want to be certain is real. She did not say anything for a long time. The wind moved through the grass around them. The sun was lowering toward the western horizon, painting the prairie in copper and amber. He's down there, she said quietly. Not a question. Probably, Ray said. We need to call someone. Ray was already reaching for his phone to call Dana Reeves when he saw the lights on the access road. 2 trucks moving fast, followed by a third vehicle he recognized after a moment as a concrete mixer. They came across the property without slowing, cutting through the long grass, heading directly toward the well site with the purposeful momentum of people who know exactly where they are going and why, and are operating on a schedule that does not include interruption. Ray and Jesse moved back into the deeper grass without discussion, an instinct shared without a word. Garrett Marsh stepped out of the lead truck. He was wearing different clothes than the day he had come to offer $50,000. Work clothes now, practical clothes. The clothes of a man who has come to do something rather than to perform something. His face in the failing light was stripped of the performed warmth it had carried during that earlier visit. He was directing men with equipment, pointing at the well cap, issuing instructions in a low voice that Ray could not make out from the distance. The concrete mixer positioned itself. Hoses were run. The work was practiced and fast, the movements of people who had been briefed on exactly what needed to happen and were being paid well enough to do it without asking questions. Within 30 minutes, a new layer of concrete, thick, dense, poured with the focused efficiency of men operating under time pressure, had been applied over the old cap, over the letters, over the evidence that a man named Clifton Marsh had sealed this well in 1953 In the same year, his business partner had disappeared from the face of the earth. Garrett stood and watched the work with the expression of a man checking items off a list, the particular focused satisfaction of someone managing a problem rather than solving it. Because this was not a solution, this was a delay. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where people keep things they know but prefer not to examine, Garrett Marsh probably understood that. Then as the mixer was being repositioned, he turned and looked directly at the darkness where Ray and Jesse were standing. He could not see them, Ray was certain of that, but he turned toward them anyway, toward the specific patch of darkness where they happened to be, and called out in a voice calibrated to carry across the field and into whatever ears might be listening. Mineral rights give me authority over subsurface water sources on this parcel, Mr. Colton. Sealing abandoned wells is standard safety procedure. Perfectly legal. I'd recommend consulting with a lawyer before making any accusations you can't support. He got back into his truck. The convoy moved back toward the access road and disappeared into the dark, leaving behind the smell of fresh concrete and the sound of engines fading, and the particular silence that follows when something significant has just happened and the night has closed back over it. Ray and Jesse stood in the grass beside the newly sealed well and listened to the engines fade to nothing. The concrete was still wet, gleaming faintly in the last of the daylight, smooth and featureless where the letters had been. He knows, Jesse said. Her voice was steady. Everything we found. He knows. He's known we were close for days. Dad, she turned to look at him. In the failing light, her face was serious and calm in a way that did not belong entirely to a 16-year-old. A calm that had been earned the hard way through the past year of watching everything familiar become uncertain. You got all of it on video. Ray looked down at his phone. He had been recording from the moment the trucks appeared on the access road, had kept recording through the concrete pour, through Garrett's declaration into the darkness. Garrett Marsh, directing his crew, destroying a crime scene, and announcing his legal justification for it because he was frightened enough to want a record of his reasoning. I got all of it, Ray said. They stood together in the darkening field, two people who had arrived at this broken place with nothing, standing over the spot where the truth had been buried twice now, and still refused to stay down. What do we do tomorrow? Jesse asked. Ray looked at the freshly poured concrete, at the place where the letters had been, at the ground that held its secret with the particular patience of ground that has been waiting a very long time and has learned that waiting is the one thing it does better than anything else. Tomorrow, he said, we go to the state. There is a moment in every long fight when the outcome becomes visible for the first time. Not certain, nothing is certain until it is finished, but visible, the way a destination becomes visible through fog when you have driven far enough toward it. The fog does not clear all at once. It thins degree by degree until the shape of what you have been moving toward emerges from the gray and you understand that you were heading in the right direction all along, even in the stretches when you could not see it and had only the direction itself to trust. Ray Colton had that moment on a Thursday morning in a government building in Topeka, Kansas, sitting across a conference table from a state investigator named Thomas Vance. But that came later. First there was the drive. And before the drive, there was the tape. Agnes had called the previous evening, after Ray had briefed her by phone about the concrete poured over the well, about the video he had captured, about the meeting with Dana Reeves and the filing of the complaint with the state attorney general's office. He had expected again the careful voice of a woman conserving what remained of her courage. Instead, she had said, "Come tomorrow morning, bring Jesse. There is one more thing I have been holding on to, and it is time." They arrived at her house at 7 in the morning. Agnes answered the door in her gray wool coat, already dressed for the drive to Topeka that she had apparently decided she was making, whether anyone invited her or not. Her house was sparse and neat, the furniture old and well-maintained, and on the mantelpiece were photographs Ray had not seen before. Walt as a young man, Walt in his uniform, Walt standing in front of the farmhouse when it was new and the windmill was turning. 70 years of keeping vigil in the space of 4 walls and a mantelpiece. Agnes sat at her kitchen table and reached into the drawer that Ray had seen her open once before, the locked one, and from it she produced a cassette tape. Old, the plastic case yellowed and cracked at one corner, the tape itself showing the slight sheen of magnetic oxide that had been many things in the decades since someone had pressed a record button and spoken into a microphone. Walter gave me this the night before he went to meet Clifton. Agnes said. She placed it on the table between them. He found a recorder at the hardware store, sat at my kitchen table and spoke into it for 20 minutes. Said he wanted there to be something that couldn't be misread or misrepresented. Something in his own voice. She looked at the tape. I have listened to it twice in 70 years, both times alone. Tonight I want to listen with people who understand what it means. Ray drove to the thrift store in Garden City and found a cassette player, a battered portable unit that ran on batteries and looked like it had last been used sometime in the early 1990s. He tested it in the parking lot with a cassette someone had left inside, an old country album, tinny and distant through the small speaker, and confirmed it worked. Back at Agnes's kitchen table, with Jesse sitting beside the old woman and Ray across from both of them, Agnes inserted the tape with hands that did not tremble, because she had been preparing for this moment for 70 years and was not going to let her hands embarrass her now. She pressed play. The speaker hissed. Then Walt Briggs's voice filled the small kitchen. The room went very still. His voice was not what Ray had expected, though he could not have said what he expected. It was a steady voice, a working man's voice, with the particular flatness of the Kansas plains in it, and underneath the steadiness there was fear. Not overwhelming, not paralyzing, but present in the way fear is present in the voice of a man who has assessed a situation honestly and found it dangerous and decided to proceed anyway. Agnes, if you're hearing this, I didn't make it back. I want you to know what happened and why, so the record is complete. So there's no version of this where Clifton gets to write the ending. A pause. The sound of a breath drawn and released. Clifton Marsh has been stealing from our partnership since the second year of our operation. I have documentation of everything. The false sales records, the diverted payments, the invoices for work that was never done. I have hidden copies of all of it at 4 locations on the property. The journal is in the root cellar. The notarized statement is in the barn foundation. The financial records are in the wall of the house near the chimney. The letters he sent me are in the back of the root cellar wall. Anyone who finds those things will have everything they need. Another pause. Tomorrow morning I'm going to meet Clifton at the old well. He says we can settle this between us. I believe he means to kill me. I am going anyway because I cannot think of another way forward. A man who runs from his own evidence hands the story to the person who wants to bury it. I would rather face him with everything I have and lose than let him write the ending without a fight. The tape hissed softly. When Walt spoke again, his voice was quieter. There will be someone, Agnes. Maybe not soon. Maybe not for a long time. But someday someone will come to that land who gives a damn about what happened there. When that person comes, you give them everything. You let them finish what I couldn't. Promise me. The tape ran on for a few seconds in silence. Then it clicked off. The kitchen was quiet except for the prairie wind against the window and the sound of Agnes breathing. Slow and deliberate. The breathing of a woman who has held something for 70 years and can feel the weight of it finally beginning to lift. Jessie reached across the table and put her hand over Agnes's. Ray sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the cassette player and thought about a man who had pressed the record button and spoken into a microphone on the night of October 11th, 1953, and in doing so had sent his voice 70 years into the future to a kitchen in western Kansas where a man he had never met and a daughter he could not have imagined would sit and receive it like something precious that had been in transit for a very long time. He knew you were coming, Agnes said to Ray. Her voice was even. He just didn't know your name yet. Ray did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. They left for Topeka at 5 in the morning. Ray and Jessie in the truck, Dana Reeves following in her own car, Agnes in the passenger seat beside Ray, small and upright in her gray wool coat, watching the dark country roll past with the expression of a woman for whom arriving at this particular destination has been the organizing fact of her entire adult life. Nobody spoke much in the first 2 hours. Jessie fell asleep against the window with her jacket bunched under her cheek. The highway unrolled ahead in the headlights, the prairie flat and enormous on both sides. The sky beginning its slow transition from black to indigo somewhere around the 2-hour mark. At some point in the 3rd hour, without preamble, Agnes said, "He was afraid, you know. Walt, in the end." Ray kept his eyes on the highway. "He came to me the night before. October 11th, he sat at my kitchen table and he was afraid. And he showed it, which was something Walt didn't do easily. She paused. He showed me everything he had put together. Every document, every record, every letter. He told me where he had hidden the copies. He made me promise. What did you promise? That if he didn't come back, I would wait. That I would keep everything safe and I would wait for someone who would care enough to finish it. Her voice was even and steady, the voice of someone reciting something they have rehearsed for decades. Not because it requires rehearsal, but because saying it out loud requires a certain formality to be survivable. He said, Agnes, there will be someone, maybe not soon, but someday someone will come to this land who will understand what happened here. When that person comes, you give them what they need. Ray said nothing. The highway unrolled ahead of them. I waited 11 years before I accepted he was never coming back. She said it without particular inflection, the way people describe facts that have been processed so many times. They no longer require emotion to carry them. And then I kept waiting anyway, because I promised. Topeka appeared on the horizon eventually, the Capitol dome catching the early light, and Ray pulled into the government complex parking lot with the particular clarity of a man who has driven 4 hours toward a reckoning and arrived at it and is ready now to see what it holds. Thomas Vance was 53 years old, gray at the temples, with the unhurried manner of a senior investigator who had learned that urgency is a form of error, that the most important things require stillness to assess properly, and that the appearance of being moved too quickly by evidence is itself a form of evidence about the quality of the work. He came into the conference room carrying a legal pad and a cup of coffee and sat down across from them without ceremony. Dana laid out the case in the order she had organized it during the drive, which was the order of a person who understood that the first job was not to impress, but to be believed. The partnership agreement, the journal, the notarized statement, the property records showing the fraudulent seizure, the 12 threatening letters, culminating in the one that named the well. The video of Garrett Marsh and his crew pouring concrete over a potential crime scene in the middle of the night while announcing his legal justification to the darkness. And finally, the cassette tape, which Dana played through the small, portable player Ray had purchased that morning. Walt's voice filled the conference room. Vance listened without interrupting through the entire presentation. He made notes. He examined each document with the care of someone accustomed to evaluating the difference between evidence and story, between what can be proven and what can only be suspected, and between what a good investigator knows and what a good investigator can take to court. When Dana finished, Vance looked at Agnes. Mrs. Holt, he said, you've held this evidence for 70 years. Yes. Why not come forward earlier? Agnes considered the question with the patience of someone who has considered it 10,000 times and has a clear answer that still requires care in the telling. Fear in the beginning. Clifton Marsh was a powerful man in a small place, and I was a young woman alone, and I had watched what happened to Walt when he stood up to that power. She folded her hands on the table. Later, it became something else, waiting for the right person, waiting for someone who would understand not just the facts but the meaning of them. Vance looked at Ray. And you're that person. I'm the person who showed up, Ray said. I bought the ranch because I had $9,000 and nowhere to go. I found the box because it was in the cellar of a house I was trying to make livable. Everything after that was just following what was there. You had no prior knowledge of the Marsh family or their holdings. I'd never heard of them before I got here. Vance looked at him for a long moment with the evaluating gaze of a man who has been lied to professionally for decades and has developed reliable instincts about it. Then he looked back at the documents and the cassette player and the photograph of Walt Briggs that Agnes had brought, the one from the mantelpiece, Walt in his uniform with his bronze star and the Kansas plains behind him. There is one significant gap, he said. The well, everything points to it, but we don't have confirmation of what's inside it. Garrett Marsh poured new concrete over it 2 nights ago, Dana said. I know. Vance tapped his pen against the legal pad, which is why I'm treating that video as evidence of consciousness of guilt rather than as an obstacle. A man doesn't pour concrete over an abandoned well in the middle of the night because he is concerned about public safety. He set the pen down. I'm recommending immediate action. Court order for excavation within 48 hours. full forensic investigation of the property seizure and subsequent mineral rights transfers. Agnes closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were wet, but her posture had not changed. "There is one more thing," she said. She reached into the inside pocket of her gray wool coat and removed a small envelope, sealed, aged to the color of old cream. The kind of envelope that has been opened and resealed many times and finally sealed for the last time, with the understanding that the next person to open it would be the person it was always meant for. She placed it on the table and slid it toward Vance. "I have been carrying that for 70 years, she said. "It is a marriage certificate, dated October 9th, 1953. Vance opened the envelope carefully. He read the document inside, and his expression did not change the way most people's expressions change when they receive unexpected information. It simply became more still. "Agnes Harper," he read, "and Walter H. Briggs, married in Shawnee County, Kansas on October 9th, 1953. 2 days before Walt went to meet Clifton," Agnes said. "He wanted me protected legally in case something happened. We went to Topeka to find a judge who had no connection to Ford County. We were going to tell everyone after Walt settled things with Clifton. We were going to announce it and celebrate and begin our life." She stopped. "We never got to do that part." The room was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. Vance looked at Dana. As Walt Briggs's legal widow, Mrs. Holt would be the heir to his estate. "Which means," Dana said, "that the fraudulent seizure of 1954 deprived not just a business partner, but a surviving spouse of her legal inheritance. The mineral rights, the water rights, the land itself, all of it should have passed to Agnes under Walt's estate. And every subsequent transfer of those assets," Vance said, "is built on a foundation that would not exist if the seizure is voided." "Garrett Marsh's $640,000 in mineral rights," Jessie said from her chair at the end of the table, which was the first time she had spoken since they sat down, "belongs to her." Everyone looked at Jessie. She held the attention without flinching, which was something Ray noticed and filed away, the way a father notices things about his child that mark a change in who they are becoming. "Yes," Vance said, "that is what this means." The court order came through in 38 hours. The excavation team arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, 6 people in a white state vehicle, a ground-penetrating radar unit, and a compact excavator on a flatbed trailer. Dana was there. Ray was there. Jessie stood beside him at the edge of the cleared area. Agnes sat in a folding chair that Ray had carried from the house, wrapped in her gray coat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the preparations with the focused stillness of a woman who has been waiting for this particular morning for 7 decades and is not going to look away from it now. Garrett Marsh's attorney had filed 2 emergency injunctions before noon the previous day. Both had been denied, dismissed with language that the court clerk read to Dana over the phone with what sounded like quiet satisfaction. The lead investigator was a woman named Dr. Patricia Hale, forensic specialist, methodical and calm, in the way of people who do difficult work regularly and have made their peace with what it requires of them. She walked the site, examined the fresh concrete Garrett had poured, and directed her team to begin at the perimeter, documenting every layer before disturbing anything below it. The new concrete came up in sections, revealing the 1953 cap beneath. The original cap, with its cast letters, Marsh Construction, 1953, was photographed from every angle before it was disturbed. Dr. Hale's team moved with the deliberate care of people who understand that what they are doing cannot be undone, and that the record they are making here will matter in ways that extend beyond this field and this Tuesday morning. The well was 40 feet deep. It had been dug at a depth inconsistent with water access in this part of Kansas, where the water table sat much higher. There was no practical agricultural reason for a well this deep in this location, Dr. Hale noted this in her initial report without editorial comment, because the job of a forensic investigator is to record what is and allow the facts to carry their own weight. On the second day of excavation, they found bones. Ray was standing 30 feet back with Jessie when Dr. Hale emerged from the equipment cluster and walked toward them with the measured pace of someone carrying news they have delivered before and have not grown accustomed to. "We've located human remains consistent with the time period in question," she said. "I want to prepare you before we proceed further." Ray nodded. Dr. Hale looked at Agnes in her folding chair, who had been watching the excavation with the focused stillness of a woman who has been waiting for this particular moment for 7 decades and is not going to look away from it now. Not when she is this close to the end of the longest promise she ever made. "Mrs. Holt," she said gently, "we found a wallet, a belt buckle, and a ring." She held up an evidence bag. Inside it, tarnished nearly black but intact, was a gold signet ring. Even through the plastic, the engraving was visible. W.B. Agnes made a sound that was not a word. It was the sound of something that has been held in place by will and patience and the discipline of a long promise finally being allowed to move after 70 years of being held still. Ray crouched beside her chair. He put his hand over her folded hands and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. Jessie, on Agnes's other side, put her arm around the old woman's shoulders and held her the way you hold someone when words have reached the end of what they can do. The three of them stayed like that while the investigation continued around them, while the prairie wind moved through the long grass, while the autumn sky sat enormous and pale above the Kansas flats, while 70 years of waiting arrived, at last, at its destination. Inside the well, alongside Walter Briggs's remains, investigators recovered one additional item: a pocket watch. Silver, tarnished black, its hands stopped at 347. "Doctor." Hale brought it to Ray in an evidence bag and held it beside the watch Ray had found in the cellar floor, the one he had been carrying in his jacket pocket since the day Agnes first reacted to it. Through two separate evidence bags, the two watches sat side by side, identical in every respect. Same case, same size, same wear pattern at the edges, same inscription on the back of each: W.B. to C.M., brothers in arms. Ray looked at both watches for a long time. Walt had given Clifton Marsh a pocket watch on the day they signed their partnership because he believed they were building something together, because he believed in the man standing beside him. That watch had ended up in the well with Walt's body, taken back by Clifton, or returned by Walt in the final confrontation as a way of saying, "I know what you are, and I am giving back the pretense that you were something better." Either way, it had gone into the dark water with the man it was meant to honor. The other watch, the one that had fallen between the floorboards of the cellar, dropped in the struggle, or hidden in the dark in some last desperate moment, had waited there for 70 years for someone to come along with a work lamp and a screwdriver. One watch in the cellar floor, one watch in the well. Two objects that told, between them, the complete story of what had happened at 3:47 on the morning of October 12th, 1953. "We also recovered a tool," Dr. Hale said. Her voice was professionally neutral. "A pipe wrench, cast iron, consistent with the period. The handle bears a stamp, Marsh Construction." A pause. "There is biological material on the head of the wrench, degraded but potentially recoverable." Ray said nothing. He looked out at the well site, at the place where the ground had kept its secret for 70 years, and thought about Walt Briggs walking across this field in the early morning dark of October 12th with a briefcase full of documents and the conviction that truth was sufficient protection against a man who had already decided what needed to happen. He thought about the particular cruelty of that, of dying not because you were wrong, but because you were right, and the person who needed you to be wrong had the means and the will to enforce it. He thought about the iron box in the cellar, sealed and hidden and waiting, and the care with which Walt had prepared his evidence across 4 locations on this piece of Kansas property, knowing he might not survive to use it himself, preparing for the possibility that justice might have to travel further than one lifetime to arrive at its destination. It had traveled 70 years. It had arrived. Garrett Marsh was arrested at the excavation site. He had arrived mid-morning with his attorney, apparently believing that his physical presence might exert some influence on proceedings that were, by that point, well beyond the reach of local influence. He stood at the perimeter and watched with the expression of a man watching a building he owns burn down. And when Dr. Hale's team brought up the pipe wrench and the evidence was cataloged in front of him, something went out of his face that did not come back. Some quality of certainty, of the unexamined confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged, that had served him and his family for generations and was now reaching the end of its useful life. 2 state troopers approached him with the careful professionalism of people who have done this before. Garrett Marsh, you are under arrest for destruction of evidence and obstruction of justice in connection with an active forensic investigation. His attorney began speaking immediately, a rapid, confident stream of legal language, and the troopers waited for it to finish before proceeding, which it eventually did, and then they proceeded. Ray watched Garrett Marsh's hands being cuffed behind his back and felt something he had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction exactly, not the clean, bright feeling of a score settled. Something quieter and more durable. The specific relief of a thing that has been wrong for a very long time being made, at least in this one respect, less wrong. The understanding that justice, when it finally comes, does not arrive as triumph. It arrives as correction, as the slow return of a thing to where it was always supposed to be. Jessie stood beside him. She did not say anything. She watched with the steady eyes of a person who has decided that bearing witness is itself a form of justice, that being present when the record is corrected matters even when the correction comes late. The Ford County Sheriff, a man named Braddock who had spent 20 years cultivating a relationship with the Marsh family and making himself useful to them in ways he had preferred not to examine too closely, submitted his resignation 4 days later, before the state investigation into county government could formally request his testimony. The county commission opened a public inquiry into the Marsh family's historical influence over local governance. A state audit of marshland holdings was initiated. The name Clifton Marsh was removed from the Ford County Civic Achievement plaque that had hung in the courthouse lobby since 1971. The removal was done quietly, on a Wednesday evening, without announcement, by a maintenance worker who had been given the assignment without explanation and completed it without ceremony, which was appropriate because there was no ceremony to be found in any of it. Carol called on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after the excavation. Ray was on the porch when his phone rang, watching the sun go down over the repaired fence line, the new post running straight and true along the western boundary of the property. He had spent the day doing the work his hands knew how to do, the honest physical labor of a man making something functional and lasting. And he was tired in the way that leaves a person feeling used well rather than used up. He saw Carol's name on the screen and answered. "I saw it on the news," she said. "What you did out there?" "We did it. Jessie was part of it." A pause on the line. "I know, she told me." Another pause, longer. "Ray, I need to say something, and I need you to let me say it without interrupting." "All right." "What my attorney did, the way she structured things, the way we handled the finances, I let it go further than it should have. I was tired and I was angry, and I told myself it was just using the legal options available to me. But I knew it wasn't right. The way you were left with nothing." She stopped. He could hear her breathing, the specific rhythm of someone choosing words carefully, wanting to get them right. "That wasn't what I wanted. I wanted out of the marriage. I didn't want to destroy you." Ray sat with that for a moment. The sun was almost down, the prairie going orange and deep purple at the edges, the sky doing what the Kansas sky does in the evenings of late fall, which is to make the world look briefly like something more than it is. "I wasn't there the way I should have been," he said. "For years. You have real grievances." "I have real grievances," she agreed. "And I handled them in a way I'm not proud of. Both things are true." This was the most honest conversation they had ever had about their marriage. Not the most comfortable, not the easiest, but the most honest, which was something they could have used 20 years earlier and were only managing now, at the far end of everything, when the damage was done and the only thing that remained was the question of what to do with the truth of it. "How is she?" Carol asked. "She's good. She's really good." "She talks about you differently now." Ray did not say anything. "She used to talk about you the way I talked about you," Carol said, with that particular tiredness. "And now she talks about you like," she seemed to search for the word, "like she respects you." "She earned that," Ray said. "Not me. She did the work alongside me." "You gave her something to work alongside." They talked for another 20 minutes, not about the past, which had been addressed as much as it could be addressed in a single phone call, but about Jessie, about school, about what came next for all of them. When they hung up, it was dark and the first stars were appearing over the Kansas plain, and Ray sat on the porch and breathed the cold night air and felt the specific lightness of a man who has put down something heavy that he has been carrying for a long time. Not the lightness of a problem solved. Some problems don't get solved, they just get accepted. but the lightness of two people deciding to be honest with each other. Finally, after years of being very skilled at not being that. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet, and maybe not completely, ever. But the beginning of something that could grow toward it, given time and the willingness of two imperfect people to keep trying. Walt Briggs was buried on a Saturday in November. The date was not accidental. Agnes had chosen it deliberately. The 14th of November had been the date they had set for their wedding, before everything. 71 years later, they had their November together, the only way that remained available to them. The turnout surprised Ray. He had expected a small gathering, himself, Jesse, Agnes, Dana, maybe a few people from the county who had followed the story in the local news. Instead, the church was full, filled with people from Dodge City and Garden City and smaller towns across Ford County who had read the story or heard it from someone who had, and who had come to pay respects to a man they had never known, but whose story had reached them through the particular way that true stories travel. Not through channels or algorithms or official pronouncements, but through people, person to person, because the truth of it resonated with something they recognized. Descendants of people who had known Walt in 1953 were there. An elderly man named Coulter, 84 years old, who said his father had worked cattle with Walt and had always told the family that something was wrong about how things ended, that the story the Marsh family told didn't sit right with what he knew of Walt Briggs' character. A woman from Wichita who had driven 4 hours because her grandmother had been a neighbor of Agnes's for 40 years and had told her the story of the woman next door who was waiting for justice that never came and never stopped waiting. They had all come because justice had come. Agnes spoke from the front of the church, standing without assistance, her voice carrying to the last pew. Walter Briggs was a good man, she said. He was not a perfect man, but he was a good one, and in the ways that matter most. Honesty, courage, the willingness to stand up for what is right, even when the cost is everything. He was better than most. She looked out at the assembled faces, at all the people who had come to say the name that had been left unsaid for too long. He was taken from all of us by a man who chose greed over honor, who chose power over truth, who believed that the right amount of concrete could bury anything permanently. A pause. He was wrong about that. Walt made sure he was wrong about that by leaving behind evidence that would outlast him, by trusting that someone would eventually care enough to find it. She looked at Ray, who was sitting in the front pew with Jesse beside him. Mr. Colton came to this county with nothing, she said. He came because he had nowhere to go, and what he found was not a fresh start, as he had hoped, but something harder and more valuable. He found a purpose. He found a fight worth having, and he fought it. Not for money, not for recognition, but because a good man's name deserved to be cleared and a good man's truth deserved to be told. Her voice was steady and certain, the voice of someone who has waited 70 years for a moment and finds, now that it has arrived, that she is equal to it. Walt would have liked him. Ray looked at the casket at the front of the church, at the bronze star and the purple heart placed on top of it, returned from the iron box to the man they had honored, and felt the particular weight of standing in the place where something unfinished has finally, at great cost and after great patience, been finished. He thought about the iron box in the cellar, about the moment he had lifted it into the afternoon light without knowing what it contained or what it would cost him or what it would return to him. He thought about a man who had hidden evidence across 4 locations on a piece of Kansas property in the October of 1953, who had gone to a meeting he did not return from, and whose final act of faith had been the belief that someday someone would come along who gave a damn. He thought that Walt Briggs had been a better judge of the future than he had any right to be. Agnes passed away 6 weeks after the funeral. She went in her sleep, in her own bed, in the house she had lived in for 70 years, half a mile from the ranch where Walt Briggs had built something and lost it and waited in the dark ground for someone to come and say his name again. The doctor said her heart simply stopped, quietly in the night, the way the hearts of very old people sometimes stop when they have finished the work they set themselves to do. Her attorney called Ray the following week to inform him of the contents of her will. She had left him everything. The ranch, fully cleared of the Marsh family's claims by court order. The mineral rights and water rights restored to Walt's estate and passed to Agnes as his widow, and now passing to Ray as her designated heir. The total value of the inheritance was assessed at just over $650,000, plus the land itself, plus the house he had been rebuilding board by board for months. There was one condition, stated in the will in Agnes's handwriting, which her attorney read to Ray over the phone in a voice that suggested he had found it remarkable. The property shall be known henceforth as the Briggs Colton Ranch, in honor of the man who built it and the man who saved it. This name is not negotiable. Ray sat down when he heard that. He sat in the kitchen of the farmhouse he had been repairing for months, at the table where he and Jesse had spread out Walt's documents and read the threatening letters and built a timeline of a 70-year injustice by lamplight, and he put the phone on the table and sat with his hands flat on the wood and breathed. The ranch was worth financially more than anything Ray Colton had ever owned in his life, more than the house on Cortlandt Avenue with the maple tree, more than the construction business at its peak, more than everything the divorce had taken from him, taken in total and added together. But that was not the thing that made him sit down. The thing that made him sit down was the name, the man who built it and the man who saved it. The way Agnes had placed those two things beside each other as if they were equivalent, as if what Ray had done, buying a broken ranch for $1 because he had no other options, following a trail of evidence left by a dead man, refusing to walk away when a powerful man told him to, was comparable to what Walt had done. Building something from nothing, holding on to it in the face of betrayal, trusting that the truth would eventually find its way to daylight even if he was not alive to see it arrive. He was not sure it was equivalent. He was not sure he had earned that comparison. But he understood, sitting at the kitchen table in the house he had rebuilt board by board, that Agnes had believed he had. And Agnes had spent 70 years being right about things. The sign went up on a Saturday in March when the first green was beginning to show in the Kansas grass and the air carried the tentative warmth of a winter deciding to end. Ray had made it himself, which felt right. Pine boards, routed lettering, sealed against the weather with 3 coats of exterior varnish, because this was something that needed to last. He had spent 3 evenings on it in the barn, which was now fully stabilized, its frame reinforced, the collapsed section rebuilt with lumber he had sourced from a mill in Garden City, and cut himself. The work had been good. The work had been the kind of thing his hands knew how to do and his mind needed to do, the particular medicine of making something real and useful and lasting out of raw material. Jesse helped him hang it on the post at the end of the access road. She was leaving in 2 weeks for Kansas State on a full engineering scholarship, an outcome that had seemed, from the parking lot of a Home Depot in Omaha 11 months ago, approximately as likely as everything else that had happened since. Her essay, the one the admissions committee had cited specifically in their acceptance letter, the one they said had distinguished her application from hundreds of others, had been about Walt Briggs and what it means when a man decides that the truth is worth protecting even at the cost of everything. It had also been about her father, though she had not named him directly, describing a man who had arrived at a broken place with nothing and had chosen to stand up rather than walk away, and what she had learned from watching him make that choice. She had read it to Ray on the porch the evening after she received the acceptance letter, reading it straight through without looking up, and when she finished, she had folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket and said simply, "I wanted you to know what I wrote." That was all. It was enough. It was more than enough. Now she held the post steady while Ray drove the mounting bolts, the two of them working together in the March morning with the ease of people who have learned each other's rhythms through shared labor, and they stepped back and looked at what they had made. Briggs Colton Ranch, established 1951, restored 2024. The March wind moved through the new grass. The windmill, repaired and turning freely for the first time in decades, caught the morning light at the top of its rotation and threw it back in a slow arc across the yard. The farmhouse stood straight behind them, its porch level, its roof whole, its paint still drying on the trim in the cold morning air. "It looks like something," Jesse said. "It is something," Ray said. She looked at him. "Are you going to be okay out here? When I'm gone?" "I'm going to be better than okay." "You'll call?" "You know I'll call." She leaned against him the way she used to when she was small, before the years and the distance and the slow accumulation of absences had grown between them, and Ray put his arm around his daughter, and they stood together in the March morning in front of a sign bearing 2 names. He thought about the iron box, still on the shelf in the corner of the room where he had placed it after the court proceedings concluded. The journal, the photographs, the medals, the documents, all of it returned to him because the court had determined that as owner of the property and administrator of Walt's recovered estate, it was his to keep and his to protect. Walt's story, entrusted to him by a dead man who had never known his name. He thought about Walter Briggs going to his kitchen table on the night of October 11th, 1953, pressing the record button on a borrowed machine, speaking into it in a steady voice with fear underneath and saying, "Agnes, there will be someone. Maybe not soon, but someday someone will come to this land who understands what happened here." He thought about what it meant to be trusted with someone else's unfinished story, about the weight of it and the gift of it, and the way those two things were, in the end, inseparable. He thought about his daughter, who had arrived here furious and defeated and was leaving for college with a scholarship and a sense of herself that she had earned in the Kansas dirt, alongside a father she had decided was worth knowing. He thought about Carol and the long, honest phone call in the dark, and the beginning of something that might or might not become forgiveness, but was at least more honest than what they had been. He thought about Agnes, keeping her promise for 70 years in a house half a mile down the road, watching the ranch decay and the Miller family prosper on what they had stolen, waiting with the particular patience of a person who has decided that some things are worth waiting for no matter how long they take. He thought that he had come here with $9,000 and a broken life and nowhere to go, and what the land had given him in return: purpose, redemption, a daughter who leaned against him without being asked, a name on a sign beside the name of a better man, was so far beyond what any dollar could purchase that the arithmetic of it made no sense, which was, Ray Colton thought, exactly how the best things tended to work. Later that afternoon, he walked out to the two graves on the eastern edge of the property. Walt and Agnes, side by side in the Kansas ground, under a granite marker he had commissioned and installed himself, set level in the earth with the care of a man who builds things to last. Walter H. Briggs, 1922 to 1953. Honest man, faithful husband. He told the truth when it cost him everything. Agnes Louise Briggs, 1933 to 2024. She kept her promise. 70 years, not one day less. Ray stood between the graves for a long time. The wind moved through the new grass around the stones with the soft insistence of something that has been moving through this country for 10,000 years and intends to keep moving. The afternoon sun was warm on his back. Somewhere beyond the fence line, a meadowlark was making its particular sound, clear and carrying and optimistic in the way of birds that have no reason to be otherwise. The sound of the Kansas spring asserting itself against the memory of the long winter. "Thank you," he said, to both of them, to the ground and the sky and the 70 years of patient faith that had led him here, "for trusting me with this. I'll take care of it." He meant the land. He meant the name on the sign. He meant the story, Walt's story, which was now also his story, which had become the story of what happens when a man stops running from his own wreckage and turns to face it, and finds in the turning that what he thought was the end of something was only the beginning of something else. He stood there until the meadowlark moved on to a different part of the field and the wind shifted and the afternoon light began its long, slow change toward evening. Then Ray Colton walked back toward the ranch house, toward the evening work, toward the life that was waiting there for him to continue building it one day at a time, the way good things are built, slowly, carefully, with attention to the foundation and respect for what the ground remembers. Behind him, the sign at the end of the access road stood in the March light: Briggs Colton Ranch established. 1951, restored 2024. The wind moved through the Kansas grass in long, slow waves, the way it had moved for 100 years before either of those names existed, and the way it would move for 100 years after both of them were forgotten by everyone still living. But not yet, for now the names were there, and the ground remembered, and the truth had found its way home at last, and that was enough.